Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding, and today I am delighted to be joined by my friend, who is also published by HarperCollins, Helen. Well, her name on the book is slightly different from how I know her, is Helen Glynn Jones, and her book that's just been published is called The Last Raven. And before we get down to talking about that, Helen, hello, welcome to Mythmakers.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So let's start where all of us start. We are going to throw you back in the time machine to being that young girl who probably loved reading, I'm guessing, and was going around the books of the library and bookshops. What were the kind of fantasy books that were the spark that got you interested in writing?
So I did read a lot as a child and still do, not perhaps as much as I used to, but yeah. So my fantasy favorites when I was younger were Narnia, of course. I absolutely devoured those books, adored them, still do, still read them now. I also loved Alan Garner, The Owl Service, the Weird Stone books. I remember I still can feel that claustrophobic feeling I felt. There's that bit where they go underground and they're in those really tight little tunnels and they almost get stuck. And it just stayed with me, that wonderful feeling. And the way he wrote it and give us that feeling. Um, One of my absolute favorites, though, is Susan Cooper's Dark is Rising series, which is just, I mean, I just think that is utterly, utterly brilliant.
I wish we'd known each other as little girls, because they're all the ones I
I,
absolutely adored. The funny thing, you mentioning the Alan Garner thing, I've been having a bit of an Alan Garner moment because I went
mm,
to hear his daughter and Robert Powell talk about his work because he's just turned 90.
yeah,
Um, and it reminded me that the Weird Stone, as you said, I always thought when I picked it off the shelf, I always thought it was the Weird Stone of Brising Armon,
yeah.
because you don't know how to say it.
No, I don't. I
And
still
he said
don't.
it's the weird stone of Brisingamen, I think is how you actually say it.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, it's one of those words where you embarrass yourself when you meet, the Alan Garner fan who knows exactly how it's said.
Yeah, that's why I didn't say it.
Yeah. Um, and just picking up also on the Narnia. Um, I've been listening to Narnia recently for a
Mm.
project I'm doing, and I decided rather than read it, I'd get the Audible versions of it. And there's an absolutely fabulous collection if anyone's wanting to cheer themselves up. I particularly recommend Kenneth Branagh
Oh, wow.
reading The Magician's Nephew. Oh, and um,
Okay.
I mean, it's got Derek Jacobi reading The Dawn Treader, and Patrick Stewart reading
Oh,
The Last Battle. Uh,
oh, amazing. I
maybe
must get them.
so. So that's a little Christmas treat for people if they're listening to this. We're about to go into Christmas here. If you're listening to it just before Christmas, put that on your list.
Mm.
Yeah, so obviously I'm completely understand you, Helen. I feel as though we were a very similar kind of child. You've
Absolutely.
also traveled a lot in your life, so were you born in you've got a little bit of an Aussie twang to your voice.
Yes.
So at what point did Australia happen in your life?
So I was born in the UK. I grew up in Coventry and but we moved to Canada when I was 11 and I lived there for about 14 years until I met my husband who happens to be Australian. So I went out to Australia for what was supposed to be a year and ended up staying for 17 and then came back here a few years ago.
Yes,
Uh,
I couldn't quite pigeonhole it as Australia, but it's some melange there, maybe a bit of Canada too. It's a fascinating sort of accent you've landed on.
mm.
So the Last Raven, well, we'll talk in more detail about it, but it has a use of the vampire myth. When you were traveling around the world, did you pick up different versions of the vampire myth, or do you feel we've all now settled fully on uh, I suppose, the gentleman vampire aspect?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think among like indigenous cultures in North America and in Australia, they do have, there are legends of creatures that are bloodsuckers. There's the um, Wendigo in Native First Nations cultures in North America that it it was human, but it committed a terrible crime and it got transformed into this creature that preys on humans and it's immortal unless you manage to kill it in a very specific way. And that's somewhat
Mm.
vampiric. And the skinwalkers who also prey on humans are hard to kill, but they mesmerize humans into doing terrible things, perhaps creating wendigos in the process, who knows? So there are sort of vampiric legends, and the Australian Aboriginal culture in the South particularly have a legend of a creature that lives in the trees and sucks blood, but it was never human. So there are things that seem to have it's interesting because a lot of cultures around the world seem to have stories of blood-sucking monsters of some sort, but they're not um they don't always have all the characteristics of the so-called European, the gentleman vampire that seem to emanate in Europe.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that came out in the sort of beginning of the 19th century, largely thanks to Byron,
Yes.
because John Polidori wrote a short story called The Vampire, and then
Yes.
that led to Bram Stoker, and the rest is Twilight history.
Yes. Yeah.
It, that's where it's gone. Having said which, you don't. I wouldn't really class your vampires as gentleman vampires, but they have more of the element of not being so bestial, which I think there is a version of the vampire which is much more
Yes.
of a more like the werewolf in the sense it's more sort of creaturely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
These vampires are not monstrous at
no,
all,
no, no,
but
no.
they are monsters
Oh, so tell us a
in a
little
way.
bit about what happens in your story. Actually, that's a good moment to explore your world a bit more.
The story began, it actually sort of began as a germ of an idea. I used to blog quite a lot, and a friend of mine posted a blog prompt, which was monster. And I thought humans were quite monstrous. So I came up with this character came to me, this young girl, and her parents were vampires. She was human, and she was the monster in the relationship or in the world that they lived in. It was a world ruled by vampires, and she was basically a genetic throwback of vampires' human DNA. They can have live children, and sometimes they're born human rather than vampire. And it was just this little piece of flash fiction, but her voice was so strong that it stayed with me. Um, and then more characters began to appear, like Kyle, the bodyguard, who and as soon as he appeared, I thought, well, this is going to be a romance. And so yeah, I wanted it to be so basically the book is about it's about Amelia, who is about to turn 18 and inherit half the planet. It is our world, but it's sort of a step sideways from our world in that it is now ruled by vampires, and the House of Raven, which Amelia belongs to, is they rule over Europe and North America. And it's tradition that the vampire takes over at 18 because it stops the line stagnating because vampires live such long lives. But because she's human, she's essentially been kept in the dark most of her life in many ways. Her parents have done it to protect her, but she's incredibly naive. What she does know though is that she does not want to be the heir, and so this new guard comes into her life. She got a new personal guard because she's about to step up and become, the anointed heir. And this new guard comes along, and she sees him as a way out. And she wants to go and live among humans, but she finds that perhaps human life isn't what she thought it was going to be because they're essentially cattle. They're farmed at
Yes,
this.
it's sort of across the barricades type love story in a
Mm.
way. Um, Funny, what you just said reminds me a bit of what's it called? Warm Vile Bodies or Warm? No, Warm Bodies, the one with the fact with the zombies are another culture outside the gates of the city, which is all human. That idea of seeing the humanity in the other population which is regarded as being monstrous. It's a
Mm.
wonderful theme to explore. So you've mentioned it's a romance. I wouldn't say it was entirely romantic, though. Um,
Yes.
no, I'm not going to go too far down that.
Yeah.
Um, but there is obviously a very strong association between vampires and romance in the genre. If you look at, all the books that
Mm.
have been written in the urban um, fantasy genre, for example. I'm sure we can all name lots of authors who have done this. Why do you think people think this marriage of love and vampires go together like a horse and carriage? um, because I've got some theories on this, but I would like to hear yours first.
Mm. So I mean, first I'll say for me, Raven is a romance because she gets a happily ever after, but it's
Yeah,
perhaps not the one that the reader expects.
yeah, yeah.
And because it's a series, there is more of a romantic arc to
Okay,
explore going forward. So, but yes, I agree. It's not traditionally structured, perhaps,
yeah,
without giving away anything. But I do think, I mean, I think going back to what you were saying about Byron and Polidori and Byron being this like handsome romantic figure that he based the vampire on, and from there. I also think Dracula. Dracula is a love story, really. Once you get past the horror and the gore, it's a love story that spans time. And there's, I think it's the idea of somebody who is immortal, somebody who is powerful, somebody who is intriguing and beautiful and forever young becomes a romantic figure. And then you also have the elements of darkness. You have the elements of I mean, if we're going to dig down to it, you've got the elements of penetration, you've got the elements of blood and body fluids and being in the darkness with somebody, and it all lends itself to romance if you get past the whole blood sucking thing.
yeah. I think actually, well, that's obviously got an erotic charge to it.
Yeah.
Um, that's how it works.
Yeah.
But I think there's also an element of it has rules, because one
Mm,
of the things that make romances work is when there are rules. So if you look at a Jane Austen, for example, there are etiquette rules of how how many dances you have with someone. If you write a letter to them, that's actually Mr. Darcy's letter to Elizabeth is a shocking thing in her time. He shouldn't really be writing to her. We
mm,
we don't get that now, but
yes.
the reader at the time would have thought, oh gosh, he's really gone outside the normal protocol. Um, and I think within vampires, if it's a vampire to human romance, there's that sense of, well, we've got rules in this relationship which, if are broken, are dangerous. It's not
Mhm.
like the you get an unmarried mother pregnancy thing. It's you could die, or
Yes. Yes. The
you could
element of
turn
danger.
into a vampire. There's all sorts of other things going on there, and I
Mm,
think putting rules in a romance, the harder you make it for a couple to get together, the better the romance is. If it's just internet dating, yes, I like you. There's no drama,
yeah.
So I do think there is a gap in the market for an internet dating vampire novel.
Yeah.
Someone's probably done it, but that'd be quite
Oh
fun.
yeah, maybe you should write it.
You haven't done a vampire novel yet.
Ah.
It would be quite fun. Um, so how would you categorize your series in the age range? So the cover has a graphic cover, rather lovely graphic cover of the two young people at the heart of the first part in this series. But would you say I felt that the content was definitely upper end of young adult going into what was briefly called new adult. I don't know if it
Mm.
still exists as a category, but it seemed quite helpful, I think, to signal that this is somebody going into a mature world with mature themes. Um, or do you
Yeah.
think it's an adult? Because I mean, it could.
No, I think it's very much that upper end of young adult into new adult, as you say. So that's sort of maybe 17 to early 20s kind of age. And yeah, so it's and because of that, within that genre, you tend to get books that are a little bit faster paced and not quite as long as some of the adult fantasy novels that are out there, adult
Yeah.
romantasy fantasy novels. So And it does, I think it fits into those categories because of the age of the protagonist and the life changes that they're going through. You know, Amelia is figuring out who she is. She's growing as a person. She's taking her first steps into the world in a lot of ways. And there's a world of difference in preference in the type of things that a 13-year-old reader and an 18-year-old
Yeah,
reader would want
yeah.
to read, yet they're both said to be served by YA, which is why you do get such a broad range of books within that. So mine is definitely at the upper end.
Yeah. No, I mean it's always frustrating with this age range thing because I really feel it should be this is a minimum age for reading, not a maximum. So I think there's a
Yeah,
lot of enjoyment that adults can get from YA novels, but they may feel they don't go to
absolutely.
those shelves because they think, oh, someone's looking at me if I go there. So I would encourage you to roam in a bookshop, um, because there are such great YA that's written. So you
That's
mentioned just then that it's a coming of age story, and yes, and Amelia definitely has a wonderful character arc, very satisfying character arc in this, where she gets finds her power, um,
yes.
definitely, which is always wonderful. Um, so thinking back, do you remember reading some coming of age stories that have sort of meant a lot to you, or life lessons that you were sort of putting into this, putting into The Last Raven?
Um, So I think for me, and I'll actually go back to what you're saying before too about the age ranges, because there wasn't when I was a youngster, there wasn't really any of that. And I was
No.
reading like Flowers in the Attic when I was 13, which was perhaps not the best book
Yeah, so was I. It was a bit
selection
of a
of love.
cult book, wasn't it?
We literally we're like the same person when it comes to books. But you know, it's quite, and I don't think that was necessarily a bad thing, but I do love that there's this whole genre and age range that is targeted to that audience because it kind of keeps the reading going rather than chucking them into adult books at the age of 13.
Mm.
Anyway, I digress. Coming of age. So, coming of age, I was kind of, I think for me, I find in a lot of young adult fantasy books that a lot of the teenage protagonists tend to be fully formed. They're kind of, you come into the story and they've already had their 6 years as an assassin or, you know, running a brothel or whatever it is they're doing and they're kind of and then they sort of go off on their adventure and they're in a way they're kind of fully formed even though they're still teenagers at a time when a lot of kids are actually figuring things out. So it was actually really important to me that Amelia started the book completely naive and just angry with everybody and making silly choices because that's who she is at that point in time because she is so sheltered. Now I was kind of thinking, I know Will is still quite young at the end of the Darkest Rising series, but he is very, very much changed by what happens to him. And I do think that it, for me, is a little bit of a coming of age story. Like he's still, I think he's only sort of 14 at the end of Darkest Rising, but he still has this incredible change within him that he goes through from the start of the first book to the end of the last book. I think Dark Materials is another one that's really great. The way that Lyra becomes who she becomes at the end of that. And I will also add in Anne of Green Gables because
Yes.
they're tiny
Yes. I
and
was
they're
going to say that.
beautiful. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're so wonderful. And you get to go all the way through to her
You
like
do.
married and having kids and her kids growing up, which I just think is marvelous.
And another shout out for Little House on the Prairie series, because that is
Yeah.
another series that follows obviously more of a real life story. That one follows a family through. It is fascinating to give enough scope for a child to grow into an adult because it is the most interesting stage to read about, really. I mean, the same thing obviously happens in Harry Potter. Uh,
Mm,
give a book per year, and naturally everybody is growing up. Um, and he has a few years where he's angry and a bit unfocused, which is
which
it's
is
quite bold.
natural.
Yeah, it's natural. So I think having a series where you can explore a character's maturation like that is a wonderful place to go. Uh,
Mm,
and I think the other, just we also mentioned early on the Narnia stories, but I was reminded that even though they're obviously very clearly for children, there is an element of sadness in all of them where they're told you cannot come back to
Mm,
Narnia again. You've got
yes.
to find me in your world.
Yeah.
Um, he slightly fudges that by killing them all off in the last
Yeah.
battle, so they don't get to grow up. But I would actually
Except
quite,
for Susan,
except for Susan, yeah,
'cause she likes lipstick
poor
and
old Susan.
boys.
Yeah, maybe she gets there later. I suspect she
Yeah,
gets there by the
I
long
do.
book.
I do too. Yeah.
Um, but I remember finding that quite difficult. How can you not be allowed to go back to Narnia? So, and I think one of the lessons I've learned of growing up is that feeling of, well, you've got to find your magic in the world that we live in, um,
Yeah.
not just in where you've escaped to in your reading. So that was a good life lesson I felt. So one of the most, again, I've got to be careful about not giving it away, but there is a very, I would say I would call this a betrayal plot.
Mm, hmm.
And it is the major twist in the story. So we're not going to talk about who is betrayed by whom.
Mm.
But I was thinking about how powerful that was as a plot line. At what point did you start with that idea, or did it just emerge as you were writing?
No, I knew that the betrayal would happen when once the book started taking shape, I knew that was going to be I'm trying really hard not to say anything
Yeah.
that's give anything away. I knew that would be a pivotal moment. And so the clues are actually there in throughout the book. There are moments, and a couple of people have said to me after reading, they've gone, "Oh yeah, actually, when I look back now, I can kind of see that the clues were there." And for me, it was the moment where, she Amelia is growing and she's making choices, but she's still with somebody. She's got somebody backing her. She's got a guard with her. She's got somebody behind her. And this was a moment where it was just her and she had to choose. And it was a moment where she had to choose whether to dig in and embrace who she was or crumble, because she could have gone either way. She could have just given up in the face of the betrayal, and then there wouldn't be any more books in the series. But
Well, yeah. Well, there's that,
yeah.
but it's also, I think,
But
it's that
yeah, it
choice.
was kind of like, that moment where where the loved one dies in another book, for example, or in a film or something, where the loved one dies or the dog dies or something, and it spurs the main character onto that final push to self-realization, I suppose, of who they are and what they really, really want. They have to choose what they really want in that moment. And it's one or the other. And that's what I wanted that moment to be for her, is that bit that pushed her to the next level.
I mean, the interesting thing from a sort of technical point of view of writing is that a betrayal plot where your main character is the one being betrayed
Mm,
is it makes um the victim of other people's decisions. And so that could be passive,
mm,
but actually it's it shows you how it's the response to something, the decision that you take when the scales
mm.
fall from your eyes and you realize what's going on. That
Yeah.
is what makes you the protagonist of this tale rather than it being the person who's plotting
Yes.
against you. uh,
Yeah. What you do in that moment that
mm,
defines you as the
yeah.
protagonist, isn't it?
And the other sort of technical thing I was thinking it was worth raising here that you mentioned was how, without giving it away, red flag, this person is up to no good, you actually have to also put in elements which mean that the betrayal feels earned. It's exactly like doing a murder mystery or a thriller. You've got to plant in the, oh, yes, of course they were, moment for the reader.
Mm.
Otherwise, it feels unfair that if you suddenly say, that
Oh,
you've
yeah.
got to like, actually, everything I wrote about them
Got to
isn't true.
seed it. It can't just drop from the sky and happen.
Mm.
It's got to be seeded all the way through. And yeah.
That's particularly true when it's a first person narrative and you're not breaking away from that person's viewpoint.
Mm,
Because obviously,
mm.
if you're doing more than one viewpoint, you can actually show somebody else plotting or hinting that they're plotting. Uh,
Yes.
so I've written psychological thriller with HarperCollins a while ago under my pen name Joss Sterling, and that's a really interesting genre to write in because there you're holding out that you're balancing this thing that everybody is untrustworthy in it. So that's another way of doing betrayal is that you can actually not have any center to the novel, so nobody you don't know
Yes.
who's on what side in that it's quite a difficult thing to write actually technically.
Yeah, yeah, I would
But it's a great
imagine
fun challenge.
so.
So where are you going to go next with your writing? I think we've just got a hint that the series continues. Have you got a title for your next part?
Yes, so I only have a working title at the moment, so I won't share it because it may change, but I do have edits.
Probably will. I always get
Yeah,
this thing
probably
from,
will.
the Charlotte and Co. At one more chapter. They say, actually, thanks for your title, but here you go. This one, this one's better. This
And
one,
they're correct, you know.
probably. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, so I have written the second book. It is now we I have just received edits. So that's where I'm going next. But the third book, which is what wraps it up, it's a trilogy, is I am writing that too. And then I've got a couple of other new story ideas, which are more high fantasy. They're not set in this world. I've got a couple of those sort of bubbling under. But yeah, at the moment, I'm still very much in the land of Raven.
Do you enjoy the process of being edited? Or is it something that you sort of have to grit your teeth to actually read the letter that tells you what's wrong with your script?
A little bit of both. No, I do actually really enjoy it because it is fresh eyes. We get so close to our work, and I think the role of an editor is just so valuable. Um, So I enjoy, yeah, it's like when you get the email, it's like, oh my gosh. And you just have to, as you say, grit your teeth and like go, okay, a little bit at a time, I'll just go through it. But once I actually get into it, I do really enjoy the process of teasing, teasing out the story a little bit more, getting it out of the tangles of the first draft.
I think it's always quite interesting editing your editor's editorial letter because when I usually print it off and I go
Mm.
and look at it and I think, okay, this first paragraph is the let's make Julia feel okay about herself paragraph. So I'm not going to take too much notice of that because that's just stopping me having a freak out. Where it really starts is the first subheading. You
Yes.
know, so once you've had enough of these, you sort of get used to it. But I think it's don't write for publication if you can't take editing
Mm,
because
absolutely.
it's such a huge privilege of getting someone skilled in
Yes.
story to help you improve. It's absolutely wonderful. And I would say I've been edited by Charlotte Ledger for a while, um, and she is just so canny. And it's a question of you start reading, and you think,
Mm.
yeah. Oh, I should have
Yeah.
seen that first time round. I had
Yeah.
an inkling that there was, oh, yes, I thought maybe there was something wrong there. So,
Thought I might get away with that, but I'm
yeah,
obviously not going to.
you're quite right. No one's going to understand what's going on there. Yeah. So, I've learned to love it, I
You do
think.
love it. You do.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, I have Charlotte as well, and she's amazing, isn't she?
Mm.
She can
Yeah.
hone in on these wonderful details. And the book is better. I'm like, I know the book will be better. I'm just slightly daunted by the huge email.
Yes, if I think the one of the daunting aspects of it is editors do try and break it down for you, but once you start shifting pieces around, it's like everything shifts. That's the tricky
Yes.
thing. So you have to keep your whole story in your head and
Yeah.
make sure it doesn't sort of start to bits don't start to drop off as you start changing out other bits. Um,
Yes. It's a real, yeah, if you pull one thread,
yeah,
yeah, it's like you've taken all the toys out of the box and you've got to figure out how to put them all
yeah.
back in again, isn't it?
Because the last edit I had with Charlotte is, in broad terms, it was everything's working really well except for the end. We really like how the drama of the end, but we don't like the setup of the drama of the end. And you're thinking, well, how can I keep the drama of the end
Oh gosh.
without this? It was really
You
tricky
would have
because
had to go all the way back.
they want you want they wanted something, but So I had to sort of what I do, I don't know if you're the same, is I leave it the most difficult parts of the edit I leave to do till the end. And I sort of let it bubble away, and eventually the answer pops up. And
Yeah.
sometimes it comes through having made the other changes.
Yes. Yeah, I'm exactly the same. I do. That's exactly what I do. I just have to let it simmer for a while and then, oh yeah, that's what I need to do
Yeah.
there.
So
It,
don't panic, it's the don't,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I know. I know it's but as you say, it is a privilege. I think it's a privilege as well. I feel very fortunate to be able to work with somebody like Charlotte who's just so very good at what she does.
Mm.
Yeah.
So, Helen, you've done many forms of writing during your life, including blogging. Do you
Yeah.
do blogging still? Are you on Substack? Are you doing that kind of thing, or are you moving to long
Um,
form now?
yeah, I was on WordPress back when WordPress was a big
Yeah, it keeps moving
it
where the
keeps
thing
moving
is.
around. So I'm not on Substack. I'm thinking about it, but at the moment I'm just it's just time, really. I haven't
Yeah,
blogged in a long time. I used to blog. I mean, if someone was to go to my blog, they'd find like 800 posts. They'd find little bits of The Last Raven in there because, as I say, it started as a blog prompt, and then I started writing other little scenes as they came to me, and I would share some of them on the blog without giving too much away. Um, yeah, so it's uh, I do ghostwriting as well, so I'm working on a ghostwriting project at the moment, and I've got edits going on. And I used to write content for other people, but I don't have really time for that at the moment.
yeah. Well, the
Maybe
long,
I'll have time to
yeah.
write my own content,
It
or
sounds,
and then advertise. And then, as you say, there's the promotional side of things too, isn't there? There's doing all the various social medias. It's a lot.
yeah. No, you've got a full plate. So,
Hmm.
to finish off, we always have a little bit of a thought experiment where we allow ourselves to go into any of the fantasy worlds ever written. So you can go into Susan Cooper's world, you can go into Star Trek or Narnia or whatever, the world of Dracula. It doesn't matter. So where in all the fantasy worlds is the best place for something? And I thought, in honor of The Last Raven, where in all the fantasy worlds is the best place to become a vampire? Now, I've got this very specifically as become a vampire because I don't mean a world where it's already a good idea to be one,
Hmm.
one where you are turned into one. Where do you think would be a good place for that?
I don't think Narnia.
No, this doesn't seem to be.
It
You'd
doesn't
probably
seem to
find
fit.
yourself with the wargs and the woozes and
Yeah, you'd be in
the
you wouldn't be in a
white
good
witches
place.
contingent,
Yeah,
probably.
absolutely. Yeah. Um, I actually kind of thought this world really is, I think, the best world to be a vampire. I think this world has a lot of darkness in it, so there's enough darkness to shield a creature of the night. If I was to actually choose a fantasy realm, then it probably would be something like Star Trek or Star Wars because I think the more fantasy realms, I think it would be difficult to set into, you know, existing magic systems and all that kind of thing to be this creature. I think it would be quite difficult if vampires do not exist in that world. To be a vampire, you'd either be hunted or you'd end up ruling the place. And I don't think either path would be easy. So I think perhaps worlds like Star Trek is an incredibly diverse world. So being a vampire there is probably going to be pretty, it's going to be okay. You're going to be accepted for who you are because that seems to be the message behind
Yeah,
Star Trek.
I think in a similar vein,
Uh-huh.
I think that probably you could imagine a story where you're like the Doctor Who's assistant and you get turned into a vampire, and he would make sure you end up in a world where it's like the dark side of the moon,
Hmm.
where he'd find you, or she would find you a place that you could exist
Comfortably.
comfortably. I suppose one of the good things about the Twilight world, um, no, I'm not particularly attracted to always going to American high school. It seems to
Yeah.
be the Cullen choice, bizarre choice. Um,
Yeah.
But at least there was a sort of vegetarian vampire option. Um, and you got sparkly skin.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I did always wonder about the high school thing. Like you're literally 117 years old or something, and you want to go hang out with a bunch of teenagers in high school.
Yeah, it's
You
a
could
weird
do
choice.
anything you wanted. You've got loads of money. You could go anywhere, do anything, and you go to high school.
Yeah, but I think on the whole, I'll choose my Doctor Who idea because I think we'd find a good place to be a vampire. I wouldn't
Yeah.
want to be a vampire here,
You wouldn't. No.
not on Earth. I can't think of a story where it's a good idea. But anyway, thank you so much, Helen, for joining us, and all the best with this series. Does the series have a series title, or is it going to be called The Last Raven?
It is called The Ravens.
The Ravens. Okay. Good luck with Ravens, parts 2 and 3, and thank you very much for coming to talk to us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.